The Institute for Health and Healing is a comprehensive integrative medicine program at Sutter Health, dedicated to healing people and transforming healthcare. Check us out at myhealthandhealing.org or on Facebook.
I am very honored to introduce Dr. Sara Gottfried. Dr. Sara is a 3-time New York Times best-selling author. She's the founder and chief medical officer of the Gottfried Institute. The organization's mission is to advance healthspan wellness via science-backed functional medicine supplements, shakes, and online courses under the brand Reset 360. Dr. Gottfried is a board-certified physician scientist. She graduated from Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so she's really smart. And she completed her residency at UCSF in San Francisco. Over the past 3 decades, she has seen more than 25,000 patients. She's a global keynote speaker. Her best-selling books include The Hormone Cure, The Hormone Reset Diet, and her latest book, which hopefully all of you have a copy of, called Younger, a breakthrough program to reset your genes, reverse aging, and turn back the clock 10 years. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara Gottfried.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy to be here. You know, I was driving through Sacramento today, and I was thinking about when I finished residency at UCSF, and I was interviewing for jobs. So I had a job offer at UCSF, I had a job offer at Kaiser, and I came up here to interview for a few jobs, and I didn't take the job here. And I was lamenting that as I was driving around the downtown because it was so beautiful, there were so many hip areas, and I just was thinking, wow, my life would be very different if I lived here. So I'm so happy to be here in Sacramento, and I also only have about 7,500 steps on my Fitbit, so I'm going to be walking tonight back and forth as we talk about the aging process and how to slow it down. So I want to start first, thank you so much, Eric Hasid, for such a stellar talk. I feel like you covered the foundation so beautifully, and one of the things you mentioned is my first tip, which is gratitude. You know, a heart full of gratitude slows down the aging process. So I want to thank the Institute for Health and Healing for having me. Thank you, Maxine, for all the work that you've done over the past 3 decades. Thank you to Judith for leading the charge. And thank you to all the staff at the Institute for Health and Healing. So I want to begin with a little moment in history. It's 2009, and Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF got the Nobel Prize for her work on telomeres. Have you guys heard of telomeres before? Eric mentioned them in his talk. So they're the little caps on chromosomes, and they're the marker of biological aging as opposed to chronological aging. Now I pay attention when a woman especially wins the Nobel Prize, like I sit up and I want to hear. What did they do? And Elizabeth Blackburn did a very interesting study. She looked at women, mothers, at UCSF, 2 groups. She took one group that had a sick child in the intensive care unit. So these were moms, mostly 30s and 40s, sick kid in the ICU. And she compared their telomere length, how fast they were aging, to another group of controls. And these controls were mothers who had a healthy child. So you would think that the women who had a sick kid would be aging faster. But that's not what she found. What she found was that what matters is your perceived stress. So among all the women, those who had the highest perceived stress were aging the fastest. So when I heard this, I thought, uh-oh. Because I was a mother, I'm still a mother, you're sort of always a mother, right? But at the time I was a mother in my 40s, and I thought, wow, I bet this is really affecting my own patients, men and women. And I think I need to find out more about this. Now, at the time, I had my own functional medicine, integrative medicine practice, and I was following pretty much all the principles that many of which Eric talked about tonight. So I had, a good diet, what I thought was a good diet. I was a yoga teacher because I'm kind of a type A personality, you may have noticed that. And I'm now an A-. I'm more of a type A-. So I'm like slowly unwinding that. But what I found was when I went to the lab and tested my own telomeres, at age 45, I had the telomeres of a 65-year-old woman. And that is not the news you want to get, right? That was a bad day. So even though my hormones were in good balance, even though I felt like my diet was really careful, no trans fats, I ate lots of fruits and vegetables, my perceived stress was a real problem. And so that got me interested in the aging process. That's what kind of kicked off the work that went into my third book, many of which you have. Many of you have the book now. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about what are the levers that either accelerate or decelerate the aging process, and what can we do about them? Like, what's really proven to make a difference? So some of this is motivated by some of the genetic testing that we have available. And the cost of genetic testing has dramatically decreased over time. So I know this is kind of a complicated graph. You can tell MIT is in my history here. So this is the cost per genome as a function of time. And the first genome was completed in 2003. It cost $2.3 billion. American taxpayers paid for that. Very expensive. One genome. And now you can map most of the genome, we're out here in 2018, for a few $100s. So the cost of genetic testing has really decreased. As Eric mentioned, genetics are not everything. So they're not your full destiny, but they provide a blueprint. They provide a game plan. And what we want to do is we want to use, that 10 to 20% of chronic disease that's determined by your genetics. We want to selectively turn on and off those genes so that you can live as long as possible. And I'm not talking about just longevity. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in health span. So health span is very different than disease span. The period of time that you have diseases. Health span is the period of time that you have no diseases. So I'm interested in lengthening health span. And so I want to ask you, as we begin tonight, what's your why? Like, why are you here? Why do you care about health span? Why do you care about the aging process? Because we each have different whys. For me, I have 2 daughters. I'm really curious how they're going to turn out. One's about to go off to college, don't know where yet. The other is 13. And I want to be like my great-grandmother. I grew up with a great-grandmother who was a bit of a radical. She was a Whole Foodist. She would show up at our house in suburban Maryland where I grew up with a suitcase full of kale and wheat berries. Most grandmothers, let alone great-grandmothers, show up with C's candy, but not mine. So I learned a lot from her. When I got married in 1997, my great-grandmother came to my wedding, and she demonstrated yoga poses for our guests. She could still stick her foot behind her head at age 96. She flirted shamelessly with all of the male guests that were there. And I want to be like her. She danced, and I want to be, if I could be at my grandchildren's or great-grandchildren's wedding and dance and maybe flirt. I'm not quite as much of a flirt as she is, but that's my why. Like, I really want to be there. I don't want to be using a walker. I want to be like her. Now, other people have different whys. My husband is an avid cyclist, and he wants to, has anyone heard of the Death Ride up in, yes, okay, so we've got some cyclists in the audience. So he wants to improve his time on the Death Ride, year after year after year. He also likes Mount Diablo. He is improving, he shared with me today a spreadsheet of his time racing up Mount Diablo every year for the past 5 years, and then what his projected goal is for this October. So his why is a little bit different. Another why that he wanted to add when I asked him what his why was is he wants to eat as many lemon ricotta pancakes as possible before he dies, because he just loves them. He loves brunch. He just feels like, you know, that's why I want to live a long health span. So I want you to think about your why as we go through our talk tonight. And there's a few genes that we're going to talk about. These are some of the genes. I know it's not easy to read this slide, but these are your chromosomes here in the middle. And these are some of the genes that I think are the most important to leverage as you get older. And so some of the ones that we're going to talk about tonight include the longevity genes. Up here is FOXO3, up here, SIRT2, also mTOR is over here. One thing that is aging is my eyes. This font is way too small. Oh, so much better. Yes, so we're going to talk about the longevity genes. I'll give you a really quick couple of tips here. We got gratitude. Saunas. Anyone a fan of the sauna here in the room? Oh, fantastic. Okay. So there was this really interesting JAMA article where they followed about 2,500 men in Finland. This study could only be done in Finland. You couldn't do it here in the US. And they followed these men over a really long period of time, about 21 years. They found that the men who went to a sauna 4 to 7 times a week for at least 20 minutes had a 50% reduction of cardiovascular mortality. 50%, that's huge. That's huge. I mean, that's on par with, you know, some of the medications that we give. 40% reduction of all-cause mortality. So one of the things that happens with the sauna is that it turns on FOXO3. So we all want to turn that longevity gene on. And then we're going to talk today quite a bit about intermittent fasting, because I find that it's one of those things that we all know about. It's common knowledge, but it's not common practice, because so many people don't know how to do it right. So I want to get into the details tonight about how you do intermittent fasting successfully. Because when you do it right, you can turn on the SIRT1 gene, and if you exercise after an overnight fast, you help to regulate the mTOR gene. We're also going to talk about the FTO gene. This is the probably the most important gene when it comes to weight gain. And it's, in part, it controls your leptin level, one of those hormones of satiety. So FTO is really important. I happen to have an issue with my FTO gene. So when I first did my own genetic testing about 15 years ago, in addition to, you know, finding out these bad things about my telomeres, I found that I have a problem with the FTO gene. So I'm basically genetically programmed to be about a 250-pound diabetic with thinning hair, which is not the picture that I have for myself as I get older. So I'm really focused on how do you turn these genes on and off. Another gene that we could maybe talk about in our Q&A is the breast cancer gene. There's a lot of different genes, some high penetrance, some moderate penetrance, that can affect your risk of breast cancer. We all, women in this room, have a 12.5% risk of breast cancer, and that's something that we want to change with our environmental inputs. So your DNA is not your destiny. 10 to 20% of your risk of chronic disease is based on genetics. The remainder is your environment, much of which is under your control. With some diseases like addiction, that number is a little bit different. It's It's more like 50-50 with addiction. But when it comes to chronic disease, you can use the 80-20 rule, you can use the 90-10 rule. So I want to talk about this process of inflammaging. Inflammaging is the unfortunate combination of inflammation together with the aging process. And there are certain things that tend to accelerate inflammaging in the body. And it can start early, it can start in your 20s and 30s. So wear and tear, too many wear and tear hormones, this is where cortisol really comes in. It was probably my #1 issue for why my telomeres were short and stubby instead of long and lovely. So wear and tear, too much wear and tear in the body. Western diet can do it. Insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is one of those terms that I feel like when you hear it, your eyes glaze over, honestly. And so I want to make that come alive for you, because one of the best things you can do to slow down the aging process is to be the master of your insulin pathway. And there are so many ways to do that. Certainly, intermittent fasting is a key way. But maybe the most important is getting back to the foundation that we heard about earlier. What do you put on your fork? How much exercise do you get? How hungry do you make your muscles for sugar? And one of the things that happens over the age of 40, this is more bad news. We'll get to the good news in a moment. Over the age of 40, what happens is that you start to lose muscle mass. So we know that your lean body mass tracks with healthspan. So you want to maintain your lean body mass as you get older, and I would even challenge you to grow your lean body mass as you get older. That's what my husband's doing. He's 57. The other issue is that your fat mass increases. And it's not insignificant. It's about 5 pounds per decade, starting at 40. It's a little faster in women compared to men because of testosterone. The other thing that happens is that your blood sugar rises. So on average, starting by age 50, it goes up about 10 points. So you can think back, you probably have checked your fasting blood sugar in the past couple of years. So I would love for all of you to know what your number is, even the young folks that I see over here, because fasting blood sugar is a really important predictor. There's lots of different ways of measuring how you're trafficking insulin in your body, but fasting blood sugar is one of the easiest ways, and it's something that even the most conventional doctor will test for you. You can also look at hemoglobin A1C. I also like to look at postprandial blood glucose. I check it on myself at home. I'm not a diabetic, but I check it on myself at home because it gives me a lot of information about how my body deals with certain carbohydrates. So we can get into more details about that as we move along. The other issue is leaky gut, intestinal permeability. This is where the tight junctions in your gut wall start to loosen and badness starts to come through the gut wall. So it leads to a leaky brain, and you want integrity in the gut wall. It's really important to slow down the inflammation that leads to the aging process. You can also have loss of microbiome diversity. I'm not going to talk a lot about this tonight, maybe with our next talk, because this is like, I think, the most interesting scientific information that's coming out right now. And then the result is that you get inflammation, and you can actually measure this in your blood. You can measure high sensitivity C-reactive protein, you can measure homocysteine. There's ways of measuring whether you're inflamed. Now, I often have patients say to me, okay, that's fine, I'm still a little fuzzy on this whole inflammation idea. What does that look like? Like, how do I know that I'm inflamed? So one of the things that when I have a patient who comes to see me, I look at them in the office before they come into my room. And I start to notice, are they inflamed? And one of the ways that you can tell is that their face is a little more puffy. So you may notice this on yourself, like if you go traveling, for instance, most people get more inflamed when they travel, especially if you're eating airport food. You know, that's up here with the Western diet and wear and tear. So that leads to inflammation. You can also notice it as joint stiffness and joint pain. And what we want to do is reduce it. So what reduces inflammation? Growth and repair hormones, restorative sleep, supportive nutrients like we've heard about already, exercise, yoga, meditation, and also a restricted eating window, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So in conventional medicine, we think about lifespan instead of health span. And I just want to hit a few numbers for you because my target is to change this. So aging actually begins in the body in your 20s and 30s. It starts very early. You know, when you think about something like Alzheimer's disease, you don't want to wait until you're in your 60s or 70s to start thinking about how to prevent Alzheimer's disease. You want to be thinking as young as possible and to get your ducks in a row. The average age for a diagnosis of chronic disease is 63 in the US, and the average age of death is 79. So this is what we want to change. So the idea here is that you slow down the aging process, you prevent the diagnosis of a chronic disease, and you increase your health span, like my great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother died in her sleep at age 97, very peacefully, no dragged out, experience in the hospital. She just went to bed and didn't wake up the next day. And, I think we need to have more conversations about how to die well. That's another talk. But I think she died well. She lived a really full, rich life. She was kind of a pain in the ass, as you may notice from some of my stories about her. But she was a squeaky wheel who touched many lives, mine included. So if you want to know how you're doing in terms of your health span, one of the things you can do is take an online quiz. You can do a blood panel. There's some testing that you can do, including telomere testing. You can also go to healthspanscore.com, and this is a calculator that is based on what's in the book. So the book also takes you through the questions, a questionnaire that are then weighted to determine a score for how fast or slow you are aging. So I want to talk about a few strategies to slow down the aging process. And the first is shown here. I went to a spa with my husband a couple of years ago. And we heard a little bit from Eric about high-intensity interval training class. And I knew that high-intensity interval training was a good idea, and I tried to do it on my own at the gym, and I failed miserably. I'm not very good at pushing myself hard. I need someone to boss me around. So I went to this high-intensity interval training class with my husband, who's very competitive. And we warmed up. We had an instructor who was a very handsome guy in his 30s, kind of looked like this guy. And he put these boxes in front of each of us. So the box he put in front of me was 18 inches high. So it's about here. It was a little bit higher for my husband. He was 24 inches high. He's taller than I am. And then the instructor said, okay, you're gonna jump up onto this box and then jump back down. And then he demonstrated. And he was light as a feather, jumped up like a bunny, both feet onto this box, nailed the landing, and then jumped back down. And I thought, how am I gonna do this? I'm totally gonna wipe out. I haven't done this in so long. And so I looked at the box, I kind of visualized myself jumping up on there. I mustered my courage, and I jumped up there. And I landed, I didn't wipe out. I jumped back down, and I was really proud of myself. Didn't embarrass myself, didn't embarrass my husband. And then this instructor says, okay, 14 more times. So here's what I learned. These are type 2B muscle fibers. When I went through biology way back in high school, there were two different types of muscle fibers. There was the slow twitch and the fast twitch. Now there's at least 7. And the 2Bs, in some parlance, it's the 2X muscle fibers. They are the high velocity muscle fibers. They're the super fast twitch. And they are the ones that you lose first as you get older. So that hesitation that I had as I looked at this box and had to jump up on it, that was me talking to my 2B muscle fibers, the 3 that were left. I was trying to have a conversation, and there was just not much of a message getting through my body. And what I learned was that I had neglected these muscle fibers. And you may be doing that too. Maybe you like to swing a kettlebell. Maybe you're not in this category like I am. But what I learned was that I was really missing the boat with the 2B muscle fibers. You've got to work these muscle fibers as you get older. There's lots of different ways to do it. I'm not a huge fan of the jump box. I can jump up and down on a stair. Like that I can do. But getting up to the higher heights doesn't appeal to me so much. I did buy a jump box. Of course, you can buy them on Amazon now. And it's actually an end table in my living room. It's a really pretty wooden box that I don't use. But here's what I do use. Does anyone recognize this? So this is a Peloton. And it's a really interesting indoor cardio machine. It's one of the ways of getting exercise into your day and making it really convenient and supported by technology. So I never was much of a stationary bike person, but I am totally obsessed and addicted to this particular machine. And no, I have no financial relationship to Peloton, although I was on there this morning at 5 a.m. and I was looking for all the people from Sacramento on the leaderboard. So what happens with this particular machine is that you have a touch screen and you get piped into a live class in New York where you get encouraged by the instructor to do what I did this morning was a 45-minute power zone class. And there's a reason why Men's Fitness has said that this is the best indoor cardio machine that we've ever seen. So this is the way that I work on my 2B muscle fibers. So I now have, days that I work on endurance. So I'll do a 45 to 90 minute endurance ride once or twice a week. I have days where I work on maximal effort, which is more that high intensity interval training. Tabata is another term for it, another strategy for doing it. I also do weight training, and I do all of it with one machine. So I like it simple. And this is one of the ways that I fit those 2B muscle fibers into my life. So the next strategy is intermittent fasting. And I thought I had tried intermittent fasting 5-10 years ago, but then I totally dived into the literature and really started to study it, and I realized that I was doing a totally half-assed effort. So I want to talk a little bit about intermittent fasting, the scientific rationale, as well as a little bit about how to do it. I was just looking at some data this morning about breast cancer. So there's a woman named Ruth Peterson who has studied women over time and their diagnosis of breast cancer with intermittent fasting. And she's found that if you stop your dinner early, go 13 hours before you have your breakfast, so we'll talk about some of the protocols here in a moment, that can reduce the risk of breast cancer substantially, like on the order of 30 to 60%, depending on the type of breast cancer. That's huge. That's huge. 13-hour fast. So let's talk a little bit about what this does. Well, first, it resets insulin. It's a very effective way of resetting insulin. And if you think about animals in the wild, they don't have breakfast, lunch, and dinner and 2 snacks. Like, the human body, most animal bodies, did not evolve that way. We evolved to eat intermittently. Our DNA evolved that way. So this idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner and 2 snacks is a relatively new phenomenon. And it is causing us a lot of problems. So the idea is that you're resetting insulin. It increases mental acuity. It takes about a 16-hour window to get into mild ketosis, which is where you start to change kind of your metabolic adaptation and switch from burning sugar to burning fat. So 16 hours. So let's talk a little bit about that. I tend to do a 16-hour protocol. I do it 5 to 7 days a week. And what I usually do is I stop eating by 6 p.m. and then I don't eat again for 16 hours. Okay? So that's until noon the next day. And I often will exercise, not usually a max effort, but more of an endurance ride, more of a fat burning ride before I eat. So that's an example of a 16-8 protocol. I also just mentioned that you can do a 13-hour overnight fast for the reduction of breast cancer. And there seems to be a benefit even with 12 to 14 hours. So I have a person that I write about in my books quite a bit named Jo. She's my best friend down in the Berkeley area. And she's a great friend because she thinks I'm kind of a freak when it comes to all the lifestyle things that I do. And so she keeps me kind of humble and honest. And so I was telling her, about all these benefits of intermittent fasting, and she really needs to try it. And I was doing, a 16-8 protocol, 7 days a week. And she's just like, there is no way that I am gonna, go that long without eating. There's just no way. And most normal humans will not want to do that either. So what we did with Jo is kind of this gradual on-ramp where I said, okay, could you start with 12 hours? Could you finish eating by 7 p.m., and then eat breakfast again at 7 a.m.? She's like, yeah, I could do that. So she started with that. And then after 2 weeks, we go to yoga every Sunday together. After 2 weeks, I said, okay, now I want you to go to 14 hours. So you finish eating by 7, and then you eat breakfast again at 9 a.m. And I want you to do that 2 days a week, not 2 days in a row. Do it like Monday, Thursday. She's like, yeah, I could do that. So she's on her way. She didn't jump straight up into the 16-8 protocol like I did, because I'm a freak and a nerd, and she doesn't want to do it that way. So there's lots of different ways to make this accessible in your life. So what else does it do? It reverses fatty liver. It also increases myelin. That's one of the reasons why intermittent fasting is used so commonly in people who have multiple sclerosis. It turns white fat beige. This is something that you want. Brown fat is actually really good for you. White fat is not. And intermittent fasting helps with this. It's associated with weight loss. What we know in terms of the aging process is that you want to intermittently fast a minimum of once a week to increase health span. So once a week increases health span, twice a week at a minimum helps with weight loss. Now, I tried twice a week for some period of time, and that wasn't sufficient for me in terms of resetting my hormones. And so that's why I increased the number of days that I do it. So I mentioned this already, intermittent fasting turns on the SIRT1 gene, and if you exercise after an intermittent fast, it helps to turn off the mTOR gene. This is one of those genes you want to turn off. Now, another alternative to this is caloric restriction, right? Do we have any people who are fans of caloric restriction in the room? Not a single hand has gone up. So we've known since the 1930s that if you reduce the amount that you eat by 25 to 30%, you'll live longer. But who wants to live that way? Like, that's under the category of no thank you. Like, I would rather die sooner than eat less. So the third strategy is to watch your blood sugar. We talked already about how your blood sugar rises starting in your 40s by about 10 points. And it's amazing how strong this particular lever is. So the estimates from the scientific literature is that if you just control your blood sugar, like if that's the only thing you get from our talk tonight, you know, you start jump boxing and you start to pay attention to your blood sugar, if you do that, it helps you avoid 60% of age-related cognitive decline. 60%. So that means you're going to recognize your grandchildren at their wedding. Maybe your great-grandchildren. And that's what we want. So how do we avoid a problem with insulin resistance? I want to talk about a few strategies. And I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our Q&A, so I'm going to skip over some of these. But Eric mentioned that you want to be careful about how many carbohydrates that you eat. And indeed, there was just a really interesting observational study that was published last year, where they took about 155,000 people and followed them over a long period of time. And they found that the people who ate the most carbohydrates died the soonest. The people who ate more fat died later. So very interesting data. Observational studies don't tell us cause, they tell us associations, but it bears repeating that you want to be careful about the types of carbohydrates that you eat. You don't want to go so low that your adrenal and thyroid function suffers. There's also mood issues that can occur if you have a problem with going too low with carbohydrates, but we also don't want to go too high. And so the idea here is to determine your carb threshold. What's the most healthy carbohydrates that you can eat and have your insulin in a normal, healthy place? So I'll give you a few examples here. If you have a fasting blood sugar, I try to get my patients to have a fasting blood sugar between 70 and 85. That's a much tighter optimal range compared to what a conventional doctor will do. And that's because there are a number of studies showing that if you have a fasting blood sugar that's greater than 85, there is probably some degree of insulin resistance occurring. And if I go back and look at my blood tests that I had done, you know, starting in my 20s, you can see my blood sugar rising. You can see, you know, here I had a 92. Here I had a 94. During residency, I had like 100, which is a sign that I was starting to get more insulin resistant. Probably the lack of sleep didn't help, and I was certainly eating a lot of carbohydrates in the hospital cafeteria. So you want to determine the maximum amount of healthy carbs that your insulin can tolerate, and you want to eat the minimum amount of protein. So I'm not talking about protein starvation, but you want to keep your protein within the range that helps you maintain your lean body mass. And so the way that you know that is to do body composition over time. How many of you have done body composition where you've measured your lean body mass? Great. Okay, good. Eating fiber also helps with resetting insulin. Organic, mostly plant-based foods. I eat mostly plant-based foods together with eggs and pastured eggs and wild-caught fish. Occasionally I'll have some meats that are anti-inflammatory. But this is one of those places where sometimes your genetics and also some functional medicine testing can help you get really specific about the type of diet that's going to match you the best. Intermittently fast, we've talked about that. Make your muscles hungry for glucose, especially with high-intensity interval training, Tabata, and other high-velocity movements. There's some herbs, supplements that can be very helpful. Berberine together with milk thistle is one of my favorites. So I want to wrap up here with what steals your youth. And before I do that, I just want to tell you about my repeat telomere test. So I was a little scared to get it done. But at age 49, I went back to the same lab and measured my telomeres. And remember, when I was 45, my telomeres were 20 years older than my biological age. So when I retested at age 49, my telomeres were 52 years old. So I'd closed that gap by 17 years. And my hope is to keep improving that. And these are some of the strategies that help with it. So because we get fat and we lose muscle as we get older, we want to counteract that. And exercise and movement and the way that you eat is a really key way of doing it, but you also have to track it. You don't want to eat too many carbohydrates. Carb load is not good for you. Perceiving high stress was my biggest ager when it comes to my telomeres. And there's so many different strategies for how to unwind. I often get asked, okay, what's the hot new thing that helps you de-stress? And for me, it's kind of like, do any of you have children? So when I was first faced with taking care of my babies, I quickly learned that you have to make a list of like 10 things that are the reason why they're crying, right? Check the diaper, are they hungry? You go through the list. I ended up doing this kind of weird juggling thing to get my baby to not cry. And so that was on the list. And when it comes to de-stressing, I think we need a similar list. Like have the list of 10 things that really help you unwind. And I'll give you a quick hint. Not alcohol. Don't put alcohol on the list. It's a neurotoxin. I have a lot more to say about that, but I'll stop. Isolating socially. It's another thing that robs you of youth. We know that purpose and mission, gratitude, social connection is so important for slowing down the aging process. I used to think of myself as kind of a stable person. And then I started learning about social genomics. And social genomics is this idea that we all have kind of multiple biological selves inside of us. And depending on the people that you hang out with, like these lovely people in the front row, these are really good for my best, truest self. They bring out the best. And you have that too. You have certain people who are going to bring out the best in you. And we can measure that. When you hang out with people who bring out the best in you biologically, it slows down the aging process. So I no longer think of myself as a stable biological being. I change kind of depending on who I'm hanging out with. So lacking vision and purpose can accelerate the aging process. And that's the end of the talk. We've got our Q&A next. Thank you so much.